What is the future of the European Union? What can we learn from one of history's greatest military commanders about the eventual fate of those who force empire against the wishes of real people, people committed to freedom? Today, we look back to ancient times to divine the fate of those who seek to impose their rule. King Pyrrhus's army, Roman commanders, the Brexit debate, Nigel Farage, and the harsh lessons of history that the European Union would do well to heed. All this and more on The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose with Mark Angelides, a Liberty Nation production. If Brexit is seeming somewhat a mystery to you, you're not alone. Questions I'm often asked include things like, why is this taking so much time? Why doesn't the EU just cut Britain loose? And most often, what's going to happen? These are good questions, but I'm not cursed with the gift of true prophecy like Cassandra. Perhaps for an answer, we can do as we often do on The Rabbit Hole and look to the past, this time to the ancient Greek state of Epirus, and a king who, like his close relative Alexander the Great, sought to conquer until there were no more lands over which to shed a tear. And if you've ever wondered where the term a Pyrrhic victory came from, stay tuned. It was a rare day in history when Rome was considered the underdog, but it did happen. There was a time when the Eternal City faced foes in far superior numbers and power. And this, in many ways, reminds me of Britain today. There's no denying that the United Kingdom is still a powerful nation, militarily, economically, and especially culturally. Yet it is a nation besieged. And this siege comes from an expansionist European Union that seeks power and to add territory to its burgeoning empire. King Pyrrhus lived between 318 and 272 BC, and he was related, through his mother's side, to Alexander the Great. Despite being regarded as a good and kind ruler, he had a lust for power that would eventually see his empire in ruins and an ignoble death for himself. He was born a prince and then made a refugee upon the death of his father. As often happened during these times, various camps sought to instill their own more favoured kings to the seats of power, so from the start, Pyrrhus was destined to spend his life in leadership. He became a king, lost a crown, became a king again, and embarked on a series of wars that would consolidate his power and build an empire. When a smaller nation was in dire straits with an enemy, he would step in and fight, more often than not taking over afterwards as ruler himself. At one point or another, he fought with almost every notable army of the time, and his citizens were not always pleased. For example, when Sicily was having trouble with Carthage, the cities of Sicily, they invited King Pyrrhus to come and help them out, which he did. And then, of course, he stayed on to be the leader of Sicily, planning to hand it over to one of his sons and use it as a foothold to further his attacks on Italy and Rome. But when the costs of his warring and his many projects became too much for the royal treasury, he began taxing the Sicilians. When he wanted more than they could give, he demanded compulsory contributions. And when the citizens, formerly free citizens remember, bowed to this, he declared a military dictatorship. In some ways it's reminiscent of Ronald Reagan's 9 most terrifying words. Quote, "I'm from the government, and I'm here to help." End quote. He died many years later after losing an empire, gaining a throne, and losing another empire. What killed him was not exactly a blow struck from an enemy, but a tile thrown from a roof by a woman. He was apparently paralysed or unconscious, at which point a horrified soldier, seeing the look on his face, happened along and cut off his head. Plutarch wrote of him that, quote, "The general opinion of him was that for warlike experience, daring, and personal valour, he had no equal among the kings of his time." End quote. But it is not his end that is the most enticing part of this story, but rather the beginning of his end. And this occurred at the hands of Rome many years before, and this too is where our questions regarding what will happen to the European Union and Britain will be answered. You see, what ultimately defeated Pyrrhus's campaign against the Romans was not a loss, but rather bizarrely, a series of victories. As previously mentioned, he was a great general. He often had superior forces, superior strategies. He even had war elephants to win battle after battle. But it was the victories that eventually broke him. Many historians trace the beginning of his downfall to the Battle of Ascalon in 2079 BC, in which he faced the forces of Publius Decius Mus and his co-consul. This is one of the most divisive battles in history. Depending on which sources you believe the most, either King Pyrrhus won the day, according to Plutarch, or the Romans won through, according to Cassius Dio. These disparate opinions tell us that this was a close battle either way, much like the 2016 EU referendum, that saw the pro-Brexit side win by just a few small percent, and then the continent argue about it for years later. Based on what happened after, it seems more likely that Pyrrhus was the eventual winner, but it cost him greatly. Let me tell you about a scene at the very beginning of the battle. It's from Cassius Dio's account. The two vast armies, about 70,000 men per side, were warily avoiding each other, neither side willing to launch the crucial first charge, when rumour began spreading that Publius Decius Mus was getting set to devote himself. Now, to devote oneself is a bold move. It's something Publius's father did, and his grandfather did, presumably successfully. So the idea of him doing it was pretty convincing. What it involves is this. In a devotia, the commander of the army, usually a general, would sacrifice himself to the enemy in exchange for a guaranteed victory. He would ride alone into the enemy ranks to attack, knowing full well that this was his end. And the subterranean gods, in return, would grant his side a victory, regardless of the supposed advantage of the other side. Naturally, the Romans were somewhat inspired by this, and the forces of King Pyrrhus were distraught. Pyrrhus, trying to rally his own army and stop them from breaking, sent a messenger to Publius, saying that if he tried to devote himself, he would be captured alive, and then tortured and finally killed at the king's leisure. Publius responded that he didn't need to sacrifice himself, as the Romans were going to win anyway, with or without the gods. This is the key to why Pyrrhus eventually loses against the Romans. The Romans are willing to fight, to keep on going, to push, and ultimately, if necessary, to die in the name of their cause. I'm reminded in some ways of Nigel Farage, the man most responsible for Brexit taking place. This is a leader who spent 25 years of his life fighting the European Union, exposing its flaws, battling for that one chance at a referendum. And now, as the dust settles almost 3 years down the line, he sees victory being stolen away. At a rally on March 29th, the day Britain was supposed to leave the EU, Nigel Farage spoke to an audience of thousands in front of the Houses of Parliament, and he made it clear that he was willing to do whatever it took to ensure victory. He said, quote, "What they want, the EU, is to beat us down. What they want is us to give up. What they want is us to go away. Let me tell you, am I, today, on March 29th, downcast? Am I disheartened? No, no. I am more determined to fight back against this political class than I have ever been in my life." End quote. Heading back to the ancient world, after the Battle of Ascalon, King Pyrrhus, his forces blooded from battle, said this, or words to this effect, quote, "If we are victorious in one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined." End quote. And this is what he meant, that the forces he was fighting against, and winning against, just kept coming back for more. They lose, they rally. They come back, they lose, they regroup. They get more soldiers, they come back. All the while, King Pyrrhus's armies and cash supplies keep taking hit after hit after hit. So he wins, but the more he wins, the greater his losses. It's no surprise that King Pyrrhus's name gives us that oft-used phrase, a Pyrrhic victory, a victory that inflicts such a devastating toll on the victor that it's tantamount to defeat. Nigel Farage, as much as the political elite want him and the millions of people who voted for Brexit to just disappear, will keep on fighting. And the powers of the European Union will win this battle, and then another, and maybe another. But the cost of fighting, just fighting non-stop, will eventually prove too high. It will cost them money, it will cost them time, it will cost them reputation. And much like King Pyrrhus and his unbeatable armies, it will eventually cost them their empire. Thanks for listening to The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, a production of LibertyNation.com. Tune in next week for more politics, history, legends, and excitement. See you then.